Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video what we're going to be taking a look at is essentially the possibility of miracles and the probability of miracles, of a supernatural event having occurred. In the course of this video we'll have to talk about the definition of what a miracle even is. And the reason we talk about this is if I was to give you, or anyone was to give you, or you were to read somewhere, good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus having taken place, you probably would object and say, well, come on, we're talking about a miracle. There's just a natural tendency to have an extreme bias against the conclusion that a miracle occurred. But in our case, not in our case, but in the case of the resurrection, which is the case of what we're taking a look at in this video series, certain things are in place so that we can assign a 50-50 probability to the resurrection having actually occurred. And then we can safely say, and rationally say, that the evidence is really good that all of the other possible explanations for what happened on that first Easter Sunday are not just low, the probability is not just low, it's really, really, really low. And thus, you are really, if you want to be a rational person, you are, one way to think of it is you are rationally justified in believing in the resurrection, or you can think of it as you reject the resurrection on pain of irrationality. You can reject it because people can be irrational, but in light of the evidence, when the light of the evidence is shining on you and you still reject, then you are just embracing irrationality in the process. And so the best thing you can do at that point is, try not to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's not think about that, because you want to, go hide in the dark. And not. So the reason we bring this up, I think that it's best to talk about this issue before we talk about the actual evidence for the resurrection. Because the evidence for the resurrection really just boils down to showing the low probability that all of the other possible explanations for what happened on that first Easter Sunday are really, really low. But then the question arises, well, what about the resurrection itself? What's the probability of that? And people have a hard time accepting that it's actually a 50-50 probability. And some Christians actually can make like Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher. He actually makes a good case that the probability is actually really high for the resurrection. I don't think we need to go that far, although, I think we just need to raise it up to 50-50. Okay, and then that's sufficient for us. Although I don't have a problem with, his way of doing things. It's just more of a tactical decision on my part. So I'm going to go with the William Lane Craig route in this. But to do this, what I'll do, everyone has a natural tendency, a natural instinct, a bias against accepting that a miracle occurred. If somebody tells you a miracle occurred, you're going to automatically reject it, and you're going to expect really good evidence. The old proverb says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, but the situation is not as simple as that. So what we need to do is take a more rigorous and careful look at the whole question of miracles. Are miracles possible? Are they improbable? Are they unlikely? What probability can we assign? And then, my point is this. Instead of taking a look at these objections to the possibility of miracles or the probability of miracles from the sort of common sense perspective, we're going to take a look at arguments made by actual philosophers in the 1600s and in the 1700s. And these same arguments still really carry weight for people today. And by dealing with these arguments, we will deal with the more rigorous, careful objections to miracles. Okay? So, instead of just saying, oh, miracles are unlikely, there's actual, like David Hume, for example, makes a carefully laid out philosophical arguments for why miracles are unlikely. And I think that argument, people don't know it, they don't know about David Hume, but it's in their minds. Okay, so before we talk about evidence for the resurrection, I think we need to talk about just the objections first, which is not normally the way you do things. Normally I would make a case for something, and then I look at the objections to the case that I made. But in the case of miracles, I'm thinking it's best to actually look at objections first. Okay. So, arguments against miracles. One argument that was made by I think he's Spanish. I think he might be Italian, but had a Spanish name. His name's Spinoza. Spinoza was a guy who lived in the 1600s, if I remember right. And his philosophy is a little bit confusing. Spinoza definitely believed in God. But he thought only God exists. So you can label that pantheism, like all is God, but he had an extreme form of pantheism. I think I've heard it called panentheism or something like that. I forget what the word, but anyway, he thought the existence of God is so complete and so total that no one else exists. That won't really have much of a bearing on this argument, but sometimes people get confused by Spinoza, and they think, I've just seen people think that, like, oh, his ideas are so different, you can't say anything against that because you don't understand them. Well, not really. That's what he believed. Okay, so sometimes people think that they can bring up something you don't know about, then it disproves everything that you ever say. Which that doesn't work like that, 1 + 1 = 2, regardless of what you know about quantum physics. Okay, but Spinoza's view was that the laws of nature are actually written by God. God created the world, and the laws of nature, like Newton's laws of motion in his day, things like, well, that would have come a little later, I guess. Let's look when Spinoza lived. I don't actually know. So, I always thought it was Spinoza, but then I hear people saying Spinoza. Dutch philosopher of Portuguese Sephardic Jewish origin. Okay. Died in 1677. So yeah, he predates Isaac Newton. So he didn't have Newton's laws of physics, but I guess he thought there were some laws of physics. Like we have, like, for example, Newton's laws. Force equals mass times acceleration. And then he had a few simple... Newton had just like a small set, I think 3 laws of physics, and then everything else was mathematically derived from that, like kinetic energy. And he used calculus. He invented calculus. He co-invented it. I forgot who the other guy was. Was it Leibniz? Who came up with the contingency argument. But anyway, if you understand that concept, he's just saying God created the universe, and when he did, he wrote the laws of nature. And then a miracle is when something happens contrary to the scientific laws of nature, of how the world works. Like force equals mass times acceleration. Well, if it, so for example, in Joshua, when the earth is rotating and then the sun moves backward a little bit or stops moving, well, there should have been a tremendous momentum energy we all should have gone flying off the earth, or whoever was there, and trees and everything, because we're moving, I think, like 800 miles an hour right now as we rotate around the earth, and I think we're moving around the center of the Milky Way galaxy at a somewhat phenomenal speed. Our whole solar system is. But, inertia. And so for the way that Spinoza would have seen it is like a miracle that occurs as a violation of the law of nature. And the idea is that God cannot violate his own will, and the laws of nature are an expression of God's will, therefore miracles are impossible. So the idea here is that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And this is a key argument against miracles. In the 1700s, this became huge with the deists of the 1700s. Their strongest argument in their mind was the evidence that miracles never occur. To them it was the strongest argument for God's existence. And so they believed that, God had never acted in the world or entered into the world, and that the laws of nature and their consistency is the strongest possible evidence for God. And so they saw miracles as a violation of God's will and laws, because they're violations of the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are God's will. So the issue with this argument from Spinoza really boils down to this question of what is a miracle? Is a miracle like a violation of the laws of nature? If you define it with that terminology, in other words, in logic, you would say you're begging the question with loaded language. Or you're using circular reasoning with loaded language. Like, the language is kind of loaded. Like, the Christians who lived in the next century responded to Spinoza's argument by simply saying, maybe God always intended to, make a little change here and there. Like, it doesn't really seem like that big of a problem when you think about it. Like, the odd miracle here and there may have always been part of the plan. A little wiggle, it's like there's a song with a steady beat, and then all of a sudden there's something different in the song, some sort of guitar solo or something that breaks up the chorus and verses, and all of a sudden you have the bridge or something, like, it's clear that, like, this, but whenever you hear that terminology, violation of the laws of nature, that goes back to these guys. They always wanted to use that terminology. David Hume did too. Now, the question that we do need to address is like, okay, what is a miracle? Well, all laws of science, and for example, laws of physics in Isaac Newton's situation, have an unwritten entailment, or like I don't know what the right word is, but it's just implication might be the right word, that, like, of all other things being equal, or that this is how things normally function. But it doesn't seem to really be a problem or a violation of those laws, that sometimes they don't function that way. That God could never come in and just stop them, from functioning. It's like the laws are like a machine, and the machine runs, but you, the user of the machine, can every once in a while come in and cut it off or hit pause, and like there's a tape that's playing, and that's the universe, and the laws of nature just function. But God could come in and just hit pause every once in a while on those physical laws of nature. Furthermore, God could enter additional matter or energy into the physical world, and then things would just function according to the laws of nature. So, for example, you got Jonah in the belly of the fish or the whale, how does he breathe? How does he survive down there? Well, God could just enter new oxygen into his lungs from outside of the physical universe. So like there's this implication when it comes to how the world physically operates of what's called a closed system. So, for example, classic physics problem, here's a cannon on top of a 100-foot wall, and it shoots a projectile at this angle off of level, and it's on Earth, so the gravitational force is this, and how far will it go, and how long will it take to get there, and that kind of thing. And you can calculate all of that. But that assumes that, like, nothing enters that system, like, I don't know, does it hit a tree, or something, or does it hit, or does somehow, it would be unlikely, but does another cannonball hit it from the opposing side? Something new can enter that system, and you can think about it overall, that this larger question of, is the physical universe a closed system, or could other things enter into it from the outside? Could God, since God is the creator of the universe, could enter new matter and energy into the physical universe? So, like, that, there's no scientific reason to think that the universe is a closed system. In the 1700s, people thought that, and a lot of people believed in something that was called the Newtonian world machine. But essentially, the argument for it goes back to this argument from Spinoza that, like, the laws of nature are God's will, and God wouldn't violate God's own will. Spinoza came to see nature, or the natural world, and God as the same thing. Because for Spinoza, only God exists, nothing else exists. You don't exist, only God exists. So, a better definition of a miracle might, instead of saying a violation of the laws of nature, would be to say an event that occurs that is naturally impossible in terms of the natural world, or physically impossible. Okay? But God could suspend the operation of the laws of nature, like hitting pause on the VCR, or God can enter new matter and energy into the system. And then there's the larger question of quantum physics, because our understanding of physics has advanced beyond Isaac Newton in the 1700s. And in quantum physics, the cannonball that shot out of the cannon doesn't have an actual location. It has a probability distribution for where its location is most likely to be. And that's true for all matter in the universe, which means that, like, there is a non-zero probability that that cannonball is on the other side of the universe at all times. And that's real quantum physics, but it's highly improbable, so it's not, that raises all kinds of serious questions. And I think a lot of people in our modern times, Craig says this, and I think he's right, are much more open to the idea of miracles than they were back in the 1700s because of quantum physics and the fact that we've got these probability distributions for, like, the location of anything. But this idea of the universe as a closed system in the Newtonian world machine, there is no way to scientifically prove that. That is a philosophical or metaphysical add-on to physics. You can't prove that, And in this case, Spinoza was proving it with a theological argument that's philosophically based, but it relies on God's existence. So it can't be scientifically proven because science relies on observations. And there's no way to observe whether or not observation of the physical universe can never tell you whether it's a closed system or not. Okay, so hopefully that little talk about that little argument will set us up with a framework for the rest of what we're going to talk about. I don't know what we got a list of arguments to talk about. let's talk about another argument of Spinoza's. And this is one where he thought that a miracle would actually lead people to atheism, and he saw that as a bad thing, And this was an argument that held a lot of sway for the 18th century deists. It's not that they were, in our modern day, we tend to think of like, oh, Thomas Jefferson was a deist, he was basically an atheist. George Washington was a deist, he was basically an atheist. And it's like, no. They were deists of the 1700s or the 18th century, same thing. So they weren't atheists. Okay? Like, they were, it's like a whole other religious view. They were concerned. They rejected miracles, so they thought that a miracle occurring would actually lead people to atheism. And so that was another reason they didn't believe in miracles. Because miracles would be counter evidence to the universe running according to a constant set plan. And this constant set plan is what God would do. And if miracles occur, then this would essentially be randomness, and it wouldn't have the mark of a creator. So there's this obsession with the laws of nature and the laws of science in this era, and how it's like you're reading a book God wrote, and it's simple, and like Newton can derive all of physics from like 3 simple laws. Everything is just logically derived from that. And M. Laplace put it this way. He said, if you had a being, he called it his demon, if you had a being that knew the position and momentum of every particle of matter in the universe, then that being could predict any future event and know every past event by simply working out the physical calculations. Okay? And so they were obsessed with this idea of this perfectly built machine that the universe is. These incredibly simple, short little equations. Okay, so part of the problem with that argument is that, like, well, you assume that a miracle would be used to prove God's existence. Biblically, miracles are used to prove someone is sent by God, not that. Or in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, the Jews call them signs. Signs that God sent that person. We say miracle, but that really goes back to the fact that we have this history of thinking of miracles as violations of the laws of nature, and that goes back to this obsession with the Newtonian world machine. Okay? So I don't think necessarily a miracle would lead to atheism. It really, the response is the same as that we made before, that God could want to shake things up every once in a while. Why couldn't he? Okay?